What I want to just kind of touch on is, since we're looking at this range of design and relationships, their placement and so on, we can't help but look at like the canons of proportion and how, relative one to the other one and so on. And so what I did is I kind of pulled up these different things. There's a lot of people that really talk about a golden section or a golden rectangle, golden mean. But we can also look at canons of proportion where, on the upper left on the grid, you're going to see these figures of Egyptian canon proportion. They looked at that as like their ideal beauty, okay? Or their ideal. They were looking at that proportion. Now the golden section and the golden rectangle is a mathematical way to approach this. But again, this came out in a classic period. It began in a classic period of architecture where this type of division was actually looked at as a classic that had a stability to it. There was a profound stability in these proportions. And so they built on this scaling of this same mathematical formula. And what happens is any time that you see or sense in an image, not the static quality of something, but if you start to sense that there is a relationship between the parts, you start to feel there's an undercurrent, there's something building, there's something that the artist is actually making something that's a bit more grounded. We just sense that, okay, in the images. And with these, through mathematics, they can, they achieve this kind of a balance. During a movie I worked on, was Rescuers Down Under, during that movie, we went to complete digital compositing. So they were drawn backgrounds in layers, but all of a sudden they were digitally composited. So we could scan them in a computer and move them around in a computer. It enabled us to give an amazing amount of depth. All of a sudden we were able to move things in a way and create illusionary depth that we could never do before. Okay? So we were drawing these different layers and then moving them in the computer to try to capture this depth. And it wasn't until the end of that movie, because we worked on them for about 8 or 9 months, and then we'd move on to the next movie. And the next movie was Beauty and the Beast. And it was interesting that by the end of Rescuers Down Under, the layout department and the scene planning department, they're the ones that were doing all the actual mathematic calculations. We actually found that we could draw, if our drawings were relative in scale to the illusionary spatial depth we were trying to draw, we could actually draw a more believable space. And we could move the camera through where it would make you think you're actually in a real space. So there is a relationship between those, between the scale of your objects and the way they move in space. So we would actually, from that point on, we would actually do these drawings with a pocket calculator. And we could calculate how things would move through space and how big or small we needed to draw something. We would just draw it the way we wanted to see it, and it would define our lens, if you will. And then what we did is we need to scale everything relative to that, or move all the parts relative to that. So if I had a tree in one level that was 5 inches tall, and another tree behind it that was 2.5 inches tall, the one in the front would move 2 times as fast as the one in the back. Or the camera would move 2 times as fast on that, relative to center camera. So even scaling in, scaling out, moving side to side, up and down, whatever, we could actually just work out the mathematics on our pocket calculator and know how much drawing and where we needed to be and all of that stuff. So it was really an interesting kind of a thing. We didn't rely on a golden section, and partly because, like in this image, the idea of this rule of thirds, we didn't really do that because it would mean that we would compose every picture the same way. Everything would land on these thirds, and that's really, really boring. It'll take your audience and put them right to sleep if you do that. So to be aware of this breakup, this rule of thirds, of golden section and mathematical relationships, they are there, they occur, and that's good, but it depends on what you want. Now this is an example of leveling and sharpening. But as you can see on the image up above, I did break it into thirds. So we're looking at our idea of rule of thirds. And I put a dot in the middle. okay, right in the intersection of that. And the dot is just static. I put another dot right along the line of one of the thirds. And then the one up in the upper right, I put it off of the line. It sits outside the third, okay? And it sits outside of that diagonal. So when we look at compositions, if we break them down with a grid into thirds or any grids, things that line up on some of those, we end up getting more of what we might feel as a harmony. When something sits off of those, we create tension. Okay? So even if I took an image like this, and let's just say that I placed a figure here. Okay? I'm looking at this here. Okay? So I'd make sure that I get their nose here and their eyes here on this side, right? So I'm kind of looking this way. That's going to be a little bit more passive or feel a bit more stable than if I took this and I take my thirds. Okay, if I take my thirds and I put something off of this, okay? Now, if you take a look at these two images, you see how this one feels more stable, more harmonious, and this one has a little bit more tension, okay? It might feel it's a little bit more interesting. It might feel like it has a little bit more tension. And there's two things that are happening. One, it's off of this, it's off of these thirds. And the other thing is I've directed his eyes this way, and I'm creating tension here. If I turn his eyes the other way, right? I can turn his eyes the other way. I'm still getting tension, right? Because I'm not on that area. This one still feels a little bit more harmonized, more balanced, because it sits on those thirds. But going off of this, it's like after our classical period of architecture where we had things sitting on these balances, right? Things were sitting on these golden sections, okay, of more classical type of architecture. After that, we end up with this. Okay, more of a vaulted kind of a situation. These tall steeples and things like that. You might have something way down here and these things coming up here or something like that. Now what ends up happening here is instead of this proportion, now we've got this height to stuff down in here. And this is more of a Gothic proportion. So it comes down to the division of that surface. Okay? Do we go by thirds, which appears to be more of this classical, or do we go outside absolute thirds and say, let's put it into 3 parts? Okay? I've got thirds here, and I've got thirds here. I've got thirds here and thirds there. You see how this feels a little bit more stable and flat and grid-like? This one's a little bit more dynamic, okay? In our proportions, kind of where we come from here. So if you want to create something that feels a little bit more stable, go ahead and work on this type of an arrangement. It is a good plan to have things into thirds or uneven numbers. And if you go ahead and do that in your composition, it will feel a bit more dynamic. Okay, there's going to be a response. So to sit on that's why I say when working on films, you don't always rely on that same grid all the time. And so when you want a real difference, you can push things. You could create any type of a grid or proportion. And if you wanted to rely on that or repeat that every once in a while, you'll start to build themes. And that repetition creates themes. These are fractal relationships, okay? And so these are actually African art elements, okay? Little fetishes and stuff like this on the upper left. But you can see in those squares that are going up and down. If you look at the way some of the things are broken down, if it's a square here and then a smaller square, and smaller square, and so on. These might be the areas of division. Okay? And what happened in some of the African art, they used this scaling process. And it was a method that they used for their mathematics, mathematics, they use it with their staffs. So they put notches on their staff to count for their herds, right? Nomadic, they would do that. Well, what happened? It was based on like a system, like a binary system. Like our computers run on ones and zeros, right? And series of these ones and zeros. Well, that's how they would mark these things out as well. And as far as the villages, they would scale down. There might be an open area if it was like this, and then there might be another one in here, there might be another one in here, there might be another one in here, or it would work in some other way. But they're all proportionally, it was like the same proportion scaled up and down, okay? And it gave a certain element of harmony, and it was based, again, on something like this. And this is where computer, they were dealing with computers centuries before computers were happening. So there was a project that I was working on, and it was supposed to take place in Africa, and the story was supposed to take place in Africa, and it was an animated film. And so the studio had a house look, a house design, and they wanted to incorporate their house style with African art. So when I started researching that about African art and looking at fractals and how they broke down fractals, it was going to be a CG film, and computers love fractals anyway. So it was like a big, great thing, because then we can start designing, and even maybe let the computer design some of the things. I'll show you one of the results of that. This is one of the results where I took just a hexagon, and below that you see it scaled up. Okay, so that we just extruded that straight up. So there's these equal hexagons extruded straight up. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to create a cavern. This was where the bad guy was going to be. I want to make a cavern that seemed, it would become ambiguous space, which we'll talk about, and yet have this certain kind of symmetry of some type. And so what I did was I used these hexagons and scaled them up and down, but I always made sure that they were touching in some way, because the angles and the straight edges would actually match. And so in doing that, I just did this other diagram where I scaled them up and down, and then I had one of the guys extrude that, and you get the image on the lower right. And you can see that there's a lot of variation to be had in that. There's a lot of variety and variation, and the way you light it, it could become ambiguous. And really what it was is just there's an underlying relationship between these things. And if you can establish some type of an underlying relationship, you have this credible space. And it can emote different things. Another fetish that I found interesting, and now going into this, my personal taste, this was kind of outside the range of my personal taste. And so I didn't know how to appreciate it. I didn't know how to appreciate these African sculptings and fetishes because I didn't pay enough attention to them. I didn't study them enough, and I didn't understand them. I thought, oh, they're not human proportions, and a lot of people would pass that off and say, well, they just, they didn't have the knowledge. That's not the case at all. That's not the case at all, because when you break these down, their whole world was broken into these fractal relationships, they were finding designs and patterns amongst these fractal relationships. And that was more important. That design aspect of these fractal relationships was more important than the anatomical structure. So the bottom line is, you come up with these very caricatured, but very structured and proportionate things within their own scale of proportion.